Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining our first webinar of the year. I was hoping when I was planning the webinar at the end of last year, I was hoping that the first webinar for this year was going to be on a kind of a positive note, well, let's reflect on the lessons we learned from last year and see what improvements we can make moving forwards for 2021. The title says it all, really, doesn't it? New year, new lockdown. So perhaps we'll save my forward thinking and reflection and positive forward thinking for perhaps later in the summer. Who knows? So we are now in the midst of a third lockdown, and whilst we have a vaccination program being rolled out, I think for many this lockdown in winter is feeling particularly hard. With the shortest days and the cold, wet or windy weather, it certainly is challenging. So in this webinar, Louise and I are going to talk about what this new lockdown means for employers. We're going to recap the latest government guidance on when employees are able to work in the workplace, the health and safety considerations you need to be thinking about, and a discussion really on some of the issues that are coming through from our clients, which I suspect will be relevant for many of you. This is a live webinar, so as before, please do ask any questions you may have at any point during the webinar, and Louise and I will answer them. There will also be a legal surgery at the end of the webinar, which will give you the opportunity to ask any questions, employment or health and safety related, please. Otherwise, Louise and I might be a little bit stuck. But if you can stick to those areas, but of course, do feel free to ask questions on topics that we might not have covered this morning on the slides that we go through. I'm also going to ask you to participate in a survey a little bit later on a very topical issue at the moment in relation to vaccinations and whether you may be thinking about insisting your employees are vaccinated later on in the year. So there will be a survey coming up. Let's make a start. And I think no webinar in the pandemic will probably be complete without a mention of the furlough scheme. A quick recap really of where we are with furlough. So obviously it was introduced approaching a year ago, and it has been extended and amended throughout those 10 months. So where are we now? Well, the scheme as of today, we know will run to the end of April this year, so to the 30th of April. Who are the eligible employees? Well, essentially, it's quite straightforward now. It's any employee who was on your payroll before midnight on the 30th of October 2020. And the employer must have made a PAYE real-time information submission to HMRC between the 20th of March and the 30th of October last year. However, neither the employer nor the employee needs to have been furloughed previously. And indeed, there is also no longer a limit on the number of employees you can place on furlough. So when you're looking at eligibility, all you need to look at or ask yourselves is essentially the question of were they employed prior to the 30th of October last year. We have the option of full-time furlough. So that's when an employee doesn't do any work and is on full furlough. And we still have flexible furlough. So that's where an employee will work some of their hours, and for the hours that they don't work, they're on furlough. So we have both of those schemes. In terms of the levels of support, well, this mirrors what was available under the job retention scheme back in August. So a brief reminder, that's the government covering 80% of an employee's wages up to that £2,500 cap. Now, initially, back in November or December, forgive me, I can't remember exactly when, the government said that they would be reviewing that level of support and the contribution the employer needed to make in January this year. But it has since been confirmed that actually that level of support, as put on the slide there, will remain up until the end of April. no doubt because of the situation we find ourselves in with the lockdown and the new variant. So at the moment, the employer is just contributing the national insurance contributions and pension contributions. Yes, and of course, the other point to make is, of course, you can, if you wish to do so, if you're able to do so, you can top up employees' wages above the scheme grant cap if you wanted to. A significant change is that since the 1st of December, employees under a notice period are no longer eligible. So what does this mean? Well, we can still make employees who are on furlough redundant. We can still follow a redundancy process with them. That's not an issue. But what does happen is once you've confirmed a redundancy and you issue them with notice of termination, whilst they are serving out their notice period, they cannot, they're not eligible under the CJRS scheme. They're not eligible under the furlough scheme. This will also capture employees who leave for other reasons and are under a notice period. So, for example, employees who have resigned, or employees who retired, or employees whose employment is terminating for any reason, really. It's just when they're under or serving their notice period, you can't claim the CJRS scheme. The other thing to note on that is, whilst you can't claim the grant from the government whilst employees are serving the notice period, this doesn't necessarily mean you can't keep them on furlough. So, because of course, when you ask your employees to go on to furlough, you're asking them to agree to a change to their contract, to the terms and conditions of their employment. So in principle, what you could do is say to an employer, well, whilst you're working your notice, whilst we can't claim the grant from the government, we would still require you to remain on furlough. And so essentially they would remain on furlough, so they wouldn't perform any work for you. But of course, you will be paying their wages, as you wouldn't be able to get the grant from the government. And the amount of notice pay you have to pay them will obviously depend on their statutory notice period and their contractual notice period. And I won't go into the details now, but I'm sure we've covered it in many webinars before, in that whether you have to pay them the furlough rate or whether you have to pay them 100%, well, that essentially does depend on the difference between the statutory and the contractual. So briefly, if their statutory notice period is 4 weeks, but their contractual notice period is 8 weeks, then you can get away with paying them just the furlough rate of pay. If not, you have to pay the full pay. The other point to note, and this is a change, is that from February, so from next month, HMRC are going to start publishing information about employers who submit claims under the furlough scheme. And this is to provide, they say, greater transparency and to deter fraud. So that is something just to bear in mind, really from a kind of PR perspective, really, that HMRC is going to publish information about employers who are accessing the furlough scheme. Final point before I hand over to Louise, job support scheme. Do you remember that? I think we did a webinar on it. It was going to come in, and then suddenly about 2 days before it was going to come in, we were back into furlough. That has been obviously postponed as a result of the extension of the furlough scheme. It's not currently known whether this job support scheme will be introduced once furlough ends in April. That's going to be a watch this space. So that is in the background at the moment. So the only certainty we have at the moment runs till the end of April. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Louise, who will talk you through the health and safety updates.
Thanks, Vanessa. So my part is going to basically, as I said, it's a health and safety update. We're going to look at where we are now, what the current guidance is, what the current legislation and regulations are. We're then going to look at what this means for the workplace in terms of your employees, where they're meant to be at home or at work. I'm going to flag up clinically extremely vulnerable employees and self-isolating employees, and again with some practical tips for employers as to what you need to be thinking about in terms of those two groups of people. And then I'm going to recap what you need to think about, again, just in terms of if you have got employees that are going into the workplace, just to recap what happened last year as well. And finally, I'm then going to touch upon contravention of the rules and regulations and legislation, what that could potentially mean, which therefore ties in with why the current guidance is so important from an employer perspective. So starting off then, where are we? Well, we're back into lockdown again. And from the 6th of January, government announced a further national lockdown in England. And there's also obviously lockdowns in Scotland, Ireland and Wales as well at the moment. The situation is going to be reviewed on the 15th of February. So we've got a 6-week lockdown at the moment. The guidance and the advice from the government is to stay at home. Unless you are having to leave the house for essential reasons only, people are asked to stay in their houses, and there are fines if you leave your house without a reasonable excuse. Essential reasons could be shopping, seeking medical assistance, vets, banks, but it's fairly limited. Exercise as well. But apart from that, the government are asking us all to stay at home again. So what does that mean for employers, and what does that mean in terms of the workplace? Well, you'll probably recall that last March we were told you must stay at home. And then in August, it was relaxed. The buck was passed to the employers to say, OK, you can bring your employees back into the work, provided it's safe to do so. And then we kind of had the brakes put on that again in September, where the wording was people can work from home provided they can do their job effectively. And you might recall that employers then had a bit more scope, because by that point we were realizing that's actually, while some people would work from home effectively, others couldn't, whether that's productivity, whether they were finding it so isolating, it was impacting their mental health. So employees were given more scope still to do a case-by-case basis, talking to their employees and saying, OK, how can you work best? How can you achieve what we need you to achieve without damaging the work and the productivity that you're doing? I think at the moment now the guidance has changed, the wording has changed, and now the guidance is that you can only leave home for work purposes where it is unreasonable for you to do your job from home. So what does that mean? Well, unfortunately, that's the limit of the guidance. And I think the reason being is that, again, it's quite subjective depending upon your employees, the role, what they do. But I think still this is a step up from the September position, because I think basically the rule would be that unless it's impossible for you to work from home, I think then you can go into the workplace. But I think at the moment you need to be encouraging where your employees can work from home. That is exactly where they should be staying. As I said, the police can fine you unless you have a good excuse to leave home. So say, for example, this morning, this webinar, I have a 6- and 7-year-old in the background, and I'm terrified of them coming in. So initially, when I started to prepare for this, I thought, I'll go into the office. And then I started reading the guidance and I thought, well, if the police stop me, I think saying that I'm worried about my 6- and 7-year-old interrupting me, that might not be a reasonable excuse. So I'm here and I've barricaded myself in to make sure that the kids can't come in and interrupt this. But it's something that you do need to think about for each situation. I think genuinely, if you can enable your employees to work from home at the moment, that is the practical advice. I've said that, I mean, so I could have been fined £200 if I did potentially go in and police thought that's not a reasonable excuse, or HSE thought that's not a reasonable excuse. Employers can also be fined for requesting that employees come into the workplace. You also have to take into account the fact that at the moment there's a high level of anxiety across many people and many households. And therefore, if you can take those reasonable steps to ensure that your employees can work from home, I think that's at the moment the guidance, that's what you should be doing. If it isn't practicable, if they don't have Wi-Fi, for example, and they're not able to physically do their job from home, then they can go into work. But I think at the moment that is unfortunately a last resort, and we're back to perhaps the situation that we were in March last year. As I've said, it is subjective. You need to be speaking to your employees about their personal circumstances, about their working arrangements, about what works for them. But again, if they can work from home, that's what they should be doing. The other thing that employers need to be thinking about is, you may also recall that up until last August, there was a group of people who were deemed to be clinically extremely vulnerable employees, and they were asked to shield, which basically meant, again, those people should be staying at home unless there was extenuating circumstances or they had to leave for essential purposes. Those people who have perhaps underlying conditions, they're being treated for cancer perhaps, they have COPD, or they have certain heart conditions that meant that they are at higher risk, then those people should be shielding at home. And again, they were asked not to attend the workplace. Shielding stopped in August last year. It's now been reintroduced, I'm afraid. And so for those clinically extremely vulnerable employees, they should be staying in the workplace, and employers should therefore be trying to take all reasonably practicable steps to make sure that they do not attend the workplace. So where you have got groups of people in that, what can we think about? What can we do? Well, I think some people's circumstances might have changed from last year. I think it's probably right that employers, again, should be requesting that employees contact them if they are now in that clinically extremely vulnerable category. Then they should be contacting you as an employer and saying, this is my situation now, I'm being asked to shield. And again, employers should be enabling them to work from home if they possibly can. If they can't, is there an alternative role that that person can do? Can they change their working patterns? Can they change their working hours? I'm in the position where I'm doing all sorts of crazy hours because we're homeschooling the kids at the same time. Your shielding employees may well have that same problem. Can you be more flexible? Can we think about adjusting their working hours? So if they have got to stay in home, they have got childcare provisions as well. You know, can we do something to help them so that they can still do their job, but they're working from home? So we're keeping them safe there. If they cannot do their job at home, whether it's for personal reasons, whether it's their actual role, whether practically they cannot do their job from home, then we've also got the option of furlough as well. The most important thing, and I think this flows throughout every situation from an employer perspective, is that you have that dialogue with those employees. You have discussions with them. You talk about what their situation is, and we try and get to the best possible situation for them to do their job, if at all possible, or if they need to shield, if they need to be protected, then we look at alternatives as well. And I think that's just so important. Another recap at all as well, with regards to employees that need to be self-isolating. This is a growing issue. There are more and more people that now need to self-isolate. Again, employers need to be aware of this. And in terms of the regulations, in terms of the guidance, they need to make sure that those employees that do need to self-isolate, they stay at home. If you don't comply with that legislation, there are now self-isolation regulations that came into force last year. They have been extended to March. If you don't enable your employees that need to self-isolate to stay at home, then you could result in fines. A recap also with regards to the isolation period. It's a 10-day isolation period. That date starts from if you have an employee who has symptoms of coronavirus, it's the date the symptoms start. If they're asymptomatic, but they have a positive test result, it's the date they took the test. And if they've been contacted through test and trace, that they've come into contact with someone who has tested positive, then it's the day after contact with that individual who tested positive has taken place. So again, you need to be enabling those people. If they need to self-isolate, they should be staying at home. If it's the case that they're asymptomatic, or if they have a negative test result afterwards, that employee can stop isolating, but again, provided no other member of their household or their support bubble or their childcare bubble has symptoms or is tested positive, and provided the NHS test and trace hasn't told them to self-isolate, and provided they're well. If they're unwell, then they should be staying at home, and you as the employer should be facilitating them staying at home. Practically, with regards to self-isolating employees, we touched on this on the previous webinar that we did last year. I think the guidance or the advice we can give is to make sure that you and your line managers know what the regulations are, know what you should be doing. So if you have an employee that says, I need to self-isolate, you know what the policy is. You know what you can be perhaps doing to enable them to work from home or to self-isolate, and you make sure that you follow that guidance. Employees, if they do need to self-isolate, it's important that they know to tell you the dates that their period of isolation starts and ends. And that, again, you have that dialogue with those employees that do need to self-isolate to make sure that, you know, they're working where they can, or alternative steps have been put in place if they can't work from home. So that's with regards to self-isolating employees. However, there are the situations still where, with regards to the work, they cannot work from home. You cannot provide them with the necessary equipment. There is an alternative role. Those people need to get back into the workplace because they still need to do their job. So just a recap with regards to if you have employees that are coming into the workplace, what should we be doing? What should we be thinking about? You might recall again from the webinars last year, the most important thing is to undertake a specific COVID-19 risk assessment. And I think it's worth, whether or not you should have done one of these already, if you have got employees going into the workplace, but to review that work risk assessment, review that COVID-19 risk assessment. And you'll recall that that risk assessment should cover all areas of the working day, from coming into the workplace, leaving the workplace, moving around the workplace, how your employees are sat. And the whole point is that that risk assessment enables you to look at where the hazards might be. The aim is to reduce the risk of the transmission of the virus to the lowest level practicable. And that means putting in place a social distancing, 2 meters if possible, or 1 meter with mitigation. And it's looking at all areas of your workplace and putting in place steps to reduce that transmission. So you look at the hazards, you look at the mitigating steps, and the government in their guidance has provided lots of ideas with regards to how you can reduce that risk, whether it's back-to-back working, whether it's putting in place a one-way flow system, remote meetings, whatever it is, hand sanitizers, putting up posters to make people aware of the need to wash your hands regularly. It's taking all those steps to reduce the risk to the lowest level possible. And again, that's subjective. Each workplace is different. Each resources are different. What you can do with the layout, with the people that you have, you may have a high percentage of vulnerable people that you need to think more about it. So you need to take more steps. It's very, very, very much workplace and type of industry specific. But I think it's important, given that we're in another lockdown, to undertake that risk assessment, to review that risk assessment and make sure that you're reducing the risk to the lowest level practicable. Bolster your cleaning regime that you have in place so that those people that are coming into the workplace feel safe. And again, it feeds back to that: consult your employees, have a chat with them. If the steps and the practices and procedures that you've put in place just aren't workable, you need to have that dialogue. They're the people that need to be able to comply with the policies. And you need to make sure, again, that you have oversight that your employees are complying with the policies that you've put in place. Otherwise, what's the point? Because the idea and the guidance is to ensure that those that are coming into the workplace, they feel safe. They feel, there's a lot of anxiety about it at the moment. If they are having to come into the workplace and leave their homes, you need to make sure that your employees that are there are doing their job to the best that they can. And therefore, as an employer, if you've alleviated that anxiety by putting in place these practices and procedures, then that's going to make everything run more smoothly. So consult with your employees. Ensure the risk assessments and the actions put in place are implemented. Again, there's a reminder that if you have 50 or more employees, you should be publishing that risk assessment on your website. And again, keep on top of the guidance and review regularly. It changes on a weekly, daily, monthly basis. So make sure that you're on top of that. Check the government guidance and look at what's happening in your workplace to make sure that you're on top of that for those employees that are attending the workplace. I've put this slide in now because I think it's important, because it certainly seems that people are hotter in terms of making sure that the rules, the guidance that the government have put in place and the Health and Safety Executive are put in place, they're undertaking spot checks for workplaces. And if you've fallen foul of the guidance, you're not doing all that you should be doing for your employees, then they can impose fines. And it's important to note that. Also, additionally, employees can complain to the HSE if they have concerns if they're being forced into the workplace when they can actually do their job from home, if they're being forced into the workplace when they're meant to be self-isolating, or if they have concerns about the workplace. If you haven't done a risk assessment, if you haven't considered the risk by going into the workplace, if you haven't done anything at all, those employees could be tipping off the HSE and you could be finding yourself in hot water if you've not taken any steps to think about what you could do to protect those employees that are still coming into the workplace. So it's so important at the moment to still keep the health and safety and the situation with COVID to the top of your agenda for your workplaces. Again, it all feeds back to the same thing. If you haven't taken those steps, you could be damaging employee morale and confidence in you as an employer. We want employees to be able to work. We want them back in the workplace if they cannot work from home, doing their job. If it's the case that you've not thought about, the anxiety and the other issues that are going on in the background, it doesn't instill a great deal of confidence in your employees. So I think, again, it's important that you do take everything seriously at the moment. The other thing to flag up with regards to this situation is, if it's the case that one of your employees does contract COVID and they are particularly poorly as a result, and it's found that perhaps they got it from work because steps weren't taken, you may be looking at a potential claim for personal injury or loss for an employee against you, an employee's liability case. And if that is the case, you've also got the case where, although you have employees' liability insurance, or you certainly should do, And the insurer might say, I'm not indemnifying you. The government's produced a load of guidance. You've not complied with it. You've not really done anything that you should. Your employee's now contracted COVID because you haven't made your workplace COVID secure. And, you know, you were given enough notice, and it might end up, you end up stumping the bill yourself. So again, it's so important now that we're looking at the rules, we're looking at the guidance, and we're applying it to our workplaces, given the current climate, which we will hope will ease over the coming months, but we'll have to see. So that's a recap really from the health and safety perspective. As I said, this is what employers need to be thinking about. If you can work from home, enable your employees to work from home. Think about those employees that still need a shield. Think about your policies, think about your practices, and make sure they're up to date and that everyone's aware of them, so we can, you know, get on with them and make sure they're being complied with, because there are contraventions if that isn't the case. I'm going to hand back over to Vanessa, I think, now.
Thank you. I was just trying to get myself off of mute because that wouldn't have been very helpful, would it? Thanks, Louise. I think we've got a few questions that have come in, but I think given how closely what we're talking about overlaps, I think what we'll do is we'll talk about a few of the tricky situations I've identified, and then we will answer all the questions at the end, or towards the end, or straight after this bit. Some tricky situations, the ones that are kind of cropping up at the moment, and I can speak with personal experience, as can Louise, given the description she gave of barricading herself into a room to do this webinar. And that is employees with childcare responsibilities and also potentially now homeschooling responsibilities. Of course, in normal circumstances, it wouldn't really be deemed appropriate to perhaps work from home whilst also trying to look after children. However, we're all having to look at things slightly differently in light of the pandemic. And during any period where there's a lockdown and schools and or nurseries are closed, then of course, majority of parents in the workplace are going to face this issue of trying to juggle work with childcare and the delight that is homeschooling. As my daughter said to me the other day, I am not a teacher. No, I'm not a teacher. I'll try and stick to the law. But and employers are increasingly taking a little bit of a more relaxed approach and flexible approach to home working, and allowing employees to work around childcare responsibilities, because I think many employers have a lot of compassion for the situation that their employees are working under. But of course, at the end of the day, the job still needs to be done, and employers will be keen to know that the employees are working and performing the work that they need to do. And in different industries, there will be different client or customer pressures which will need to be met. So what are the options really? And I'm going to say this probably with most of the things that I talk about on the slide, is that, it comes down really to it being imperative to have a discussion with the employee who's affected, and to look at the options and what fits for both, the employee and of course what fits for the employer. So could we perhaps look at amending hours, such as, hours are perhaps those that aren't done during the week because of childcare are, done in the evening or at the weekend. Would that work? Or do we need to enter into an arrangement where we are kind of having a temporary situation where the employee works part-time hours, and obviously with the corresponding reduction in pay? Some employees will ask to use their annual leave, and this can be suggested to employees as well. But of course, given that we don't know when schools are going to open again, and having listened to Gavin this morning, the Education Secretary, we seem no further forward as to knowing when schools are going to open, apart from the fact that we'll have 2 weeks notice. Then the option of using annual leave to cover this period of school closure seems quite unrealistic, because employees will run out of annual leave. But nevertheless, annual leave could be used perhaps to a day a week to help parents with the homeschooling, for example. We do have unpaid parental leave, which not many employees do use, but it is there. It's a statutory right to unpaid parental leave, and that gives an employee 18 weeks parental leave per child, up to the child's 18th birthday. So it's 18 weeks in total for the child reaching 18. There's a limit of 4 weeks per child per year. And the eligibility requirements are that the employee needs to have been employed with you for a year. And the employee should be providing 21 days notice of the requirement to take parental leave. And as I mentioned, it is unpaid. Now, with the notice requirement of 21 weeks, you may say that, well, given the circumstances, that you would waive that notice period, and you'd be able to do so and say, well, okay, we'll just give us a week's notice and then you can take the parental leave. But that is an option to suggest to employees who may be struggling that they take up some unpaid parental leave. There is also this right for time off to care for a dependent, and this is unpaid time off again. And it's normally, used to deal with emergencies. So when you can't really foresee the situation coming up. So in the past, it's been used if somebody, a child became ill and you needed a couple of days off all of a sudden, then you could say, well, I need to take some unpaid leave to care for a dependent, please. However, given schools closures are likely to last for a relatively long time, as Louise and I wince at the thought, many employees who consider that they can undertake some work whilst providing childcare would probably prefer to do so and ask to work flexibly rather than taking unpaid dependence leave, but it is there as well. And then, of course, the other option is to discuss furlough. So when the guidance was updated, the furlough guidance was updated on the 5th of January, it actually does make it clear in that guidance that employees may be furloughed if they have caring responsibilities resulting from COVID. And this applies to such as caring for children who are at home as a result of school or childcare facilities closing, and also applies when employees may need to care for a vulnerable individual in the household. The guidance encourages employees to speak with their employer about whether they plan to place staff on furlough. So whilst it is in the guidance that employees may be put on furlough, be rest assured that it's not an obligation for employers to put employees on furlough. So if an employee comes to you and says, well, I've got childcare or homeschooling responsibilities now, I want to be on furlough, you don't have to grant them furlough leave. But of course, having this in the guidance does, of course, perhaps place a little bit of a, shall we say, a kind of moral pressure on the employer to try and assist the employee and do the right thing. And as I said, so there's a number of options to explore there, but it's about dialogue with the employee and trying to find something that will fit for both you and them, or that will work. Another one that has been coming up recently, particularly probably a bit more before the lockdown, so maybe we'll see this a bit more as lockdown eases at some point in the future. Employees concerned about attending the workplace due to their commute. So again, we speak to the employee about what their commute entails, the particular aspects of it that they're concerned about, and make adjustments if possible. Can the employee work from home? And especially at the lockdown at the moment, they should be, if possible, to work from home. But also, if not, can we change their hours so they avoid the peak commute time, so that the buses or the trains or such forth are quieter? Is it that they're having to use public transport because there aren't any car parking facilities, or it's prohibitively expensive to park for the employee? Is there something that we can facilitate there in terms of car parking? When we're looking at employees who are concerned about the commute, this is especially important, of course, if the employee is pregnant or vulnerable, because they will be more concerned about the commute. But if an employee is kind of just saying, well, I just don't want to be on a bus for with other people, and is being quite awkward about it, not really kind of having any genuine concerns, it's just a matter of, well, I just don't want to be on a bus with other people, then and they're refusing to attend work, then strictly speaking, you don't need to pay them because they're not willing to attend work. But if the employee goes further and says they've got a reasonable belief in there being a serious and imminent danger because of their commuters in a particularly busy peak time, and it's overcrowded and such forth, then we need to be a little bit more careful, because of course if we were to dismiss, because dismissals related to health and safety concerns amount to automatic unfair dismissals with no qualifying service required, and action short of dismissal, such as disciplinary action on these health and safety grounds as well, could amount to a detriment, which is unlawful. So again, discuss the concerns with the employee before really deciding the right approach with the employee. And finally, for the moment, clinically extremely vulnerable individuals, which Louise is very helpfully taking us through. So of course, now they are required to shield at the moment. They should be staying at home. And Louise has, very helpfully gone through the options that we should be considering and the issues we should be considering. But the only point I would just make on this is that remember that these employees are entitled to SSP. So extremely vulnerable, clinically extremely vulnerable individuals are entitled to SSP if they're unable to work from home and so can't work. And that is in contrast to those that fall within just the vulnerable category. But what about employees who are caring for a clinically extremely vulnerable person, and they say that they don't want to attend work because of that? Well, the government guidance in terms of shielding doesn't go that step further to say that those that live in the same household should also be shielding. And if it's necessary to attend to work to do the job, then, strictly speaking, they should be attending work. But of course, this is going to be a very sensitive issue and needs to be handled quite carefully. So still do look at the options of, can they work from home? Or could we redeploy them into a role that is more suited to home working? Or can we offer them the safest available kind of role on site, perhaps is where they're not going to be near others? Think about the other options such as furlough. Think about the option of saying to them, well, I'm really sorry, but the job's there, needs to be done, and we can't facilitate home working, and as your job's still there, we don't feel furlough is appropriate, but you can take a period of unpaid leave. You could have that discussion with the employee as well. In terms of the risks, if you require them to attend work, otherwise they face disciplinary action, we just need to be a little bit careful about potential discrimination claims, and that's associative discrimination, i.e. the argument that you're discriminating against me because I live with a clinically extremely vulnerable person. I associate myself with that person. Associative discrimination protects individuals in relation to direct discrimination, harassment, and victimization. So we need to be thinking about taking reasonable steps to ensure the employee doesn't suffer repercussions because of their association with somebody who has a protected characteristic. And of course, those individuals that fall within the clinically extremely vulnerable category are likely, not necessarily always, but are likely to satisfy the definition of disability under the Equality Act. So, as I've mentioned, react sensitively to genuine concerns that are raised. And, in many cases, perhaps if it's going to take some time to work through with the individual as to a plan moving forwards, perhaps offer some unpaid leave while you have those discussions. So that was a few scenarios there. I can see we've got the questions coming in, which is fantastic. But before we move to the questions, I just would like you, if you wouldn't mind, to participate in a survey. So the Health Secretary very recently, as we know, said that every adult should be offered the COVID vaccine by autumn. This will obviously be dependent on the speed of the rollout and, of course, the supply of vaccines, which I'm not going to go into this morning. However, this has led to a few employers starting to think about the vaccine in the context of the workplace. And many of you may have seen the headline that came through towards the end of last week in relation to the boss of Pimlico Plumbers, with, I think the headline was "No Jab, No Job." And our Matthew Cole was on Suffolk Radio earlier in the week talking about this issue. But what we'd like to do is ask you two questions in relation to vaccinations. And I'll reveal the results a little bit later on once we've answered your questions. The survey should hopefully be popping up on your screen around about now. And I'd be very grateful if you could just take a couple of seconds to answer with your yes or no answers. The other thing I would say is it is going to be anonymous, and particularly the second question is quite controversial. Maybe not, depending on actually what the employee's role is. But if you could answer them, that would be really interesting for us to hear your thoughts at this very early stage in relation to vaccination and the workplace. So, questions. Nice to see that we have lots of questions. So we'll just take them up from the top. And I think
first one,
is that you, first one? Yeah. So I'll mute myself while you do that one.
So Nikki's queried where she has call centre people finding it hard listening to distressing calls and are feeling isolated. Would that be deemed reasonable to enable certain job roles to work from the office if they wish? I think yes, to be honest. So I find working from home isolating. I find it hard, but that's just it. And I don't think for me that justifies me going into the office. I think if you've got a situation where the nature of the role means that those people are psychologically being harmed over and above, say, our other anxieties for, what a lot of us are experiencing are problems from working from home. I think you're in a situation which is over and above that. The only thing I would say is that, again, I would speak to those employees individually, have a chat with them. If they can manage from home, and if what they're doing and the calls that they're taking is distressing them to such an extent that they would benefit from being in the office, I would just document that. I would have those conversations individually with each employee and say, look, this is a situation. Can you cope with this? To some extent, we're expected to cope a little bit more than previously was the case. I think back in September, I think we're going to have to deal with a lot more working from home, and to some extent, just get on with it. I think your situation is different, and I think that's over and above. And I think it would be reasonable in that situation for those people to go into the office, but I would just document that. I would speak to each employee and find out what their situation is. If they feel safer working from home, if they can deal with it working from home, then that's fine. If there are people that it's so distressing that they need their colleagues around them, then I do think that's different. But again, just make sure you've covered yourself. Do a risk assessment for those individual employees. So if there are any queries, there is any dispute, you can say, well, no, we thought about this, but actually, this is more than what you would normally expect from working from home. We need to protect those employees who are much, much more vulnerable because of what they do. So I hope that helps. Email me if you want any more assistance with that point.
Thank you. The next couple of questions I think are for me. So if an employee is on long-term sick due to COVID-related issues, can they be put on full furlough leave? Yes, they can. Here's the quick answer to that one. Yes, they can be placed on furlough leave, of course, just subject to the eligibility requirements in terms of when they commenced employment with you. But yes, that is an option. Can a pregnant employee who is due in June be on furlough at their request? They clean the office in the evening, and I guess the point about that is obviously they're not going to be able to work from home if they're a cleaner. And then what's the rules around maternity leave? So can a pregnant employee be on furlough at their request? No. There is no right to furlough. And that is a theme that applies to all employees in whatever category or personal situation they may find themselves in. Furlough is certainly an option for the employer to consider for the employee, but there is no right to it. But what I would say is that with pregnant, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, not least because I can't remember all the statutory provisions off the top of my head, but what we do need to remember is that pregnant employees, we need to be especially careful of, and they do need a special risk assessment taking into consideration the fact that they are pregnant. And if it isn't safe for them to do their role, then we are under, again, a statutory obligation to provide them with safe alternative work. And if we're unable to do that, then they must be placed on full pay suspension if we're unable to avoid the risks. And those are statutory obligations for employees who are pregnant, whether there's a pandemic or not. So do remember that, and therefore perhaps furlough might come across as a cheaper option potentially if you're looking at full paid suspension. Well, sorry, Louise, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to add Yeah, I was just going to add on to that. Pregnant, and you might recall that there's two categories. You've got clinically extremely vulnerable and clinically vulnerable people, and pregnant women and those aged over the age of 70 can also deemed to be clinically vulnerable. And again, as Vanessa said, though, do a risk assessment with those people, and if you feel it's safer in light of the current circumstances to take other actions so they don't have to go to work, then I think that's the way forward. Again, do that risk assessment for that individual and document it. And that's the only thing I'd add.
Thank you. Rules around maternity leave if the pandemic goes on. If you have any ideas, please. I'm not aware of any changes to the maternity leave provisions at all in relation to pandemic. They're running as per usual. The only other thing I would say is that remember, again, that for pregnant employees, if they are unable to work or absent from work 4 weeks before their expected week of childbirth, before their due date, then the maternity leave automatically kicks in. So if they're unable to work, I suspect that this rule still applies. So if they're unable to work because of the pandemic, then 4 weeks before their maternity leave is due to start, then it would automatically start, was probably the point I'd make in connection with maternity leave and the pandemic. And in relation to maternity pay, I'm sure that when you're calculating maternity pay, you need to look at their pay pre-furlough pay. So you will take their pay before they went on to furlough pay. And because that's also kind of the, if somebody, on the flip side, if somebody's on maternity leave and then comes back to work and is immediately put on furlough pay, you'll be calculating their furlough pay on pre-maternity leave pay. If that makes sense. Yes, I think it does. So that's the point in relation to maternity pay. If an employee is forced to self-isolate, can their absence be classified as sick, or should the absence be classified as authorised absence? Robert, thank you for this question. It's going to depend slightly, I think, on whether on the reason why they need to self-isolate. And if it's because they've been contacted by the track and trace team or the app and they need to self-isolate, then yes, their absence, I would say, would be classified as sick because they're actually entitled to SSP for that period. If you're requiring them to self-isolate because, well, they haven't been contacted by the app, but actually you know that they've been in contact with, say, another employee who's been in the workplace and tested positive, and you're requiring them to self-isolate, then you probably may well classify it as authorised absence, and I would say would be paid on authorised absence as well. Louise, do you have anything else to add?
No, that's my understanding as well.
Good. That's good. I think the next one's for you, the risk assessment.
The risk assessment. It is not, it's one bit of the guidance that hasn't been put into legislation. The point about publishing the risk assessment on our website, if more than 50 employees, is that a should or a must? I think, and I can't remember the exact wording in the guidance, I think it's along the lines of you are encouraged to publish it. It's not a must, but you are encouraged to do so. So I hope that kind of explains that. I will check that point and I'll get back to you. But as far as I'm aware, that hasn't been put into legislation like some of the other previous guidance has been. I think my advice is that if you can put it on your website, but I don't think that's where the health and safety executive are going to be worrying, to be honest. It's more the, have you done anything to secure your workplace, rather than if you've published something on your website. Guidance says, or it certainly encourages you to do so. And that's kind of where it sort of stays at the moment. I will check that point, but it's certainly not been put into legislation that I know. And I think the next questions for me as well. What about display screen equipment assessments provisions? What, I presume you mean what provisions apply? And one of the next webinars I think is going to be on home working and what you should be doing. The health and safety executive and the guidance is that if you have someone that's permanently working from home, you should be undertaking a risk assessment. We're kind of in a state of flux. So if you're temporarily working from home, you don't have to do that formal risk assessment of that employee's workstation in their home. Permanent, it used to be the case that some employees would go out and they would actually undertake an actual risk assessment in those employees' homes. We cannot do that right now, but we're kind of in a bit of a state of flux because we're not temporarily working from home. We've been working from home for quite a long time now. Are we more permanently? And I think the guidance is, and the guidance should be, you can't go into your employees and do that risk assessment. But I think we're now at the stage that actually you need to be giving your employees the tools to undertake their own home workstation risk assessment at the moment, including that display screen and equipment risk assessment. So I think that's where we're at the moment. If you have any other queries or you want any other points covered, because I think that's what your question relates to, then again, drop me an email and I can assist there. But at the moment, I think we're in a period of flux. I think the most practical advice I can give to employers is to give your employees the tools to undertake their own workstation risk assessment to make sure you're covered in the interim where we are home working for much longer than we perhaps anticipated would be the case. So I hope that helps. I think the next one, Vanessa, is perhaps both of us.
Yeah, I was thinking perhaps both of us. So a key worker who's required to attend a client site and refuses to use public transport as they work peak hours, what is the employer's obligation around expenses, fuel, car park, servicing, tyres? And of course, they can't work from home. Interesting question. I guess for me, the first bit will be, well, why don't they want to use public transport, and is it, health concern? And then obviously looking at the individual, why they've got the concerns. And if, particularly I suppose if they fall within a vulnerable group, then I think enabling them to, travel by car and covering the fuel and car parking expenses would be a reasonable approach for an employer to take. When it comes to servicing and tyres, etc., for me, I think that would be a step too far. Because, at the end of the day, I use this phrase which my husband always moans about whenever he hears it, but we are in unprecedented circumstances. And I think we really want to get to a situation, where we are all kind of understanding of the pressures that each other are under. And you would hope that if you're saying to an employee, okay, you've got concerns about using public transport, we will, cover the car costs in terms of fuel and car parking. You would hope an employee wouldn't turn around and try to push their luck for servicing and such forth. But then I also know from many clients that employees do sometimes try to take a step too far. Louise, what are your thoughts?
No, I think that's spot on. That's exactly what I would say, actually. So thank you. No, I think that's absolutely spot on. I think, again, it's so subjective. We're all in different situations. We've all got different personal situations. We've all got different, levels of health, and again, it's subjective. And I think you have to take into account the individual needs of your employees. Again, have that conversation. Have the conversations with them. What do they need? What can you do to assist them to do their job? Because effectively, as an employer, that's what you want them to do. But it has to be reasonable. Servicing and tyres.
Yeah, no, I know. Well, I'm sure it probably has been requested by somebody somewhere. Absolutely. So, and then one other question we have at the moment is, if a staff member is furloughed and then has to isolate, are they expected to notify the employer and switch to SSP for the period of isolation? They wouldn't be expected to notify the employer unless, of course, that is something that you've put in your furlough agreement with the employee, requiring them to do so. But no, they wouldn't, under the furlough scheme, be expected to notify the employer. And they also wouldn't be required under the furlough scheme to switch to SSP for that duration of isolation. They can just remain on furlough as they ordinarily would if they didn't need to isolate. And the same applies to if they're on furlough and then perhaps they test positive for COVID as well. You wouldn't have to necessarily just switch them automatically onto sick leave. You can just keep them on furlough. If an employee is required to self-isolate, but they request to take that time off from their holiday allowance instead of receiving SSP, is that okay? Obviously, that is a pay issue. It's a pay concern for the employee, isn't it? Because SSP is most probably going to be significantly less than normal pay. I think, if an employee, I think it's, if they've just got to self-isolate and they are well in themselves, then I think that is fine. If they, on the flip side, I suppose, which isn't really a question, but if it's because, you know, they're coming down with symptoms and they don't feel well and they want to use annual leave, then potentially still that's okay. You just got to be cautious that, you know, actually, is this at the employee's request? Because you don't later on want an argument to say, well, actually, you pay me full pay for annual leave, but I wasn't well, and therefore that should have been classified as sick leave. But yes, to answer your question, Carmel, they could use their holiday allowance instead of receiving SSP if that's what they wanted to do. We'll pause there for a minute and see if there's any other questions. But I have the survey results, which is really interesting. So the first question: would you employ someone if they had not received the coronavirus vaccine? 77% would employ, but 23% said they would not employ someone if they hadn't received the vaccine. And for question 2, would you dismiss an employee if they refuse to have the vaccine? 7% said they would dismiss, and 93% that they wouldn't. So thank you so much for participating in that. I think that I find that really interesting. In terms of kind of any observations that I might have, this is going to be such a sensitive issue coming up, and it's very early at the moment, given we you know, we're at the very early stages of the rollout, and who knows whether it's all going to go to plan. We've got quite some way to go. But interestingly, we're talking as a team this morning about Saga's announcement that they're reintroducing their holidays from May for those over 50, and they will be requiring their guests or customers, I should say, to be vaccinated before allowing them to go on holiday, taking into consideration the health and safety of their other customers. So that was quite interesting. I think, you know, the point at the moment is that, I suppose I make, is the government isn't making vaccinations mandatory. So on balance, it is going to be quite risky for employers to insist on vaccination, even in workplaces where there is close contact with vulnerable people. But you might be interested to know that ACAS have already published a little bit of guidance on this issue. They've included their view on vaccinations, which are that employers aren't able to require employees to take the vaccine and should listen to concerns if employees refuse to take it. But it does acknowledge that in some circumstances it may be necessary to make vaccinations mandatory, where it's necessary for somebody to do their job. And an example there is somebody who's required to travel overseas, and there may obviously in the future be requirements for vaccinations before you can travel. And in that case, perhaps it would make sense that an employer would require an employee to be vaccinated, otherwise they can't do their job if they need to travel. Yeah, so I think it's interesting that ACAS have already kind of thought about this issue already, even though we're quite early on in the vaccination programme. And I think no doubt we'll probably have a separate webinar on this in a few months' time, when we have more certainty as to actually whether everybody will be able to gain access to the vaccine during the course of this year. There's another question, isn't there?
Yeah, I think that's more for me. Started to talk about introducing lateral flow testing within our distribution area. Anything we should bear in mind? I think, yes, there's a lot. I think there's a policy that should be written with regards to that. There's quite a lot to think about. I'm going to come back to you on that one, if that's okay, Nikki, simply because we've dealt with something similar actually at work, and with regards to introducing testing and that kind of thing at work. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to have a think about that. I'm going to have a relook at what we did before, and then I'll get in contact if that's okay. Because there are some things, but I think primarily, if you have a health and safety person helping you out with this, you will need an appropriate policy in place, because there's all sorts of implications with doing that.
And there's data protection implications as well, which would want Matthew probably to put his input into it, I would have thought.
Yeah, so if you wanted to get in contact with us, we can perhaps assist with that, because I think there's a lot more to it. I'm sure, you may well have started to think about that in any event.
I think, but certainly it's a good question, because my husband's a key worker, and actually they've introduced lateral flow testing with a view to try to make the workplace as safe as possible. So, and obviously these lateral flow tests are now much easier to access than they were previously, although I understand they're quite expensive. So a really good question. It might be something actually we pick up on another webinar actually as well, couldn't we?
I think that's something to note as well. I mean, if there's a lot of, from an employer's perspective, there's a lot of issues coming out of that. And if there's anything, and I think Vanessa will touch upon the feedback in the meantime, if there's anything you think there's particular areas that you could do some help with us highlighting in these webinars and in the work that we're doing, then please do let us know. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, thank you everybody for watching and participating this morning. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for participating in the survey. It's been really good to see so many of you join us this morning. There is going to be, when you click out or when the webinar ends, there will be just a very quick kind of feedback page just where you can give a rating and any comments. Please do complete this, because we do look at it. We do take the comments on board, and particularly if there are other topics that you would like to be covered, then do say, and we'll do our best to cover them. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Louise, for joining me this morning. I've
just noticed I'm in my daughter's bedroom and I can just see her teddies in the background. So I thought I'd hidden everything. So I'm really sorry. You've got like a random stuff in the background. Sorry.
Well, it's the joys of working from home, balancing childcare, isn't it? So thank you very much, and we'll hopefully see and speak to you soon. Okay. Thank you. Goodbye.